this all seems rather cosy and very pleasant. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I'm speaking from Whitehaven, where I live with my wife, Lesley, and we've lived up here, well, since 2005. Lesley was actually brought up here, but we moved back here in 2005. And our background's in journalism, really. When we moved up here, we started to look at self-publishing books, and wherever we've lived, we've always sort of taken an interest in the local landscape. We enjoy walking, and we enjoy folklore and local history, and particularly that sort of unwritten local history, and the slightly odd legends and mysterious tales that you get to hear. So when we moved up here, I looked around, and the first thing I saw was that Cumbria has something called Lonnings. And just to test my sharing of screen, I will now show you a picture of a lonning. Hopefully you're all seeing that. And that is, a lonning is a dialect term for a country lane, a particular type of country lane. And this lonning is Seacross Lonning, one of the most beautiful, I think, in Cumbria. And it goes from the village of Withop Mill, which is just west of Keswick, and it goes to St. Cuthbert's Church. And what I liked was the whole idea of having the names for all of these lanes and all the different types of lanes. Let me just stop that one there. By the way, Seacross Lonning is also known as Boggle Lonning. And boggle is another dialect word some of you will, I'm sure, know, which is a term for a ghost. And the local legend is that some chap killed himself in the lonning, and hence it's Boggle Lonning. But I suspect more just a tale to tell children to get them to hurry home rather than dawdle in the lane. But I come from Rugby originally, and we just have footpaths there. But you have trods, you have drovers' roads, you have lonnings, you have waths, you have meanderings, you have all sorts of delights. And the lonnings I liked because of the name. So you've got Johnny Bulldog Lonning at Carlisle, which is where Johnny lived, and he had a bulldog. You've got Fat and Thin Lonning at Maryport, Dynamite Lonning at Cleaver Moor, Tatey Pot Lonning, even a Squeeze Gut Lonning. And I loved all these names. So we looked at lonnings first of all, and we then began looking at some of the other paths. And of course, Corpse Roads was another one that we came across in Cumbria. And let me just bring up a picture of a lonning. Of a Corpse Road. There we go. Some of you will recognise the Mardale to Shap Corpse Road. One of the, I think only two that actually has a signpost that says Old Corpse Road on it.
And the one we go down, isn't it?
That's it's always nice to see. I think it's a shame that a lot of the lonnings don't have their names on the signpost, and I think it would be nice to sort of have more signposts like this. And there are about half a dozen famous corpse roads in Cumbria, and some of you will know of these. Mardale to Shap, Grasmere, Eskdale to Wasdale, Loweswater. So we thought, well, we'll have a look at these. And as we researched, and we've been researching for about 3 years now, we've come up with about 30 corpse roads in Cumbria, or rumours of corpse roads. And I've got a map, a Google map of all of these, and I will put that on the chat at the end, and I'll also get Annette to email it around to you. And so we had to revise our plan a bit because with so many corpse roads spread all over the county, we realised we wouldn't be able to research them all in absolute detail. So our plan really was to just sort of spread the net and say, look, here's all these corpse roads. you know, join us and help us and research them. So I'm hoping some of you may even know of Corpse Roads near you, and we'll be able to offer some more information. So I better start with the definition of a corpse road, really. And corpse roads were paths that led from remote parishes to the mother church, and were the routes taken by pallbearers, by the funeral party when parishioners departed this world, and they would travel to the mother church where the person would be buried. And it could be anything from 2 miles to probably about 22 miles is the longest that we've come across so far. And marking the route might be coffin rests, wayside crosses, or chapels of ease. And I'll come on to coffin rests a bit later on. The first question, really, I suppose everyone has to ask is, why on earth bother to carry them all those miles to the mother church when you could just dig a hole in the ground and bury them there? And the answer, as with all things in our world, seems to be a combination of politics and money. The mother church made good money from burials and were reluctant to give up this monopoly. And so for a long time, they were able to order people to bring them the dead to there for burial and marriages and baptisms. And it was a good revenue stream for them. But as the medieval age sort of drew on and drew to a close, various parishes petitioned the bishop to have their own graveyards, rather fed up of carrying them all over the fells, the dead all over the fells. And these petitions, which really give the sort of best primary source for uh, corpse roads, all followed the basic sort of pattern. I think basically one parish hit on a winning formula and then everybody else copied it. So it talked about the difficulties walking it. And I thought I'd just quote from one of them. And the obvious one to quote one is the one that goes, the petition goes from Killington and Furbank parishes to Kirby Lonsdale. And the petition was made in 1585. And the people from Killington and Furbank complained by reason of their distance from the parish church and by reason of inundations and of storms frequently raging in those parts in the winter season, they cannot carry their dead to be buried without great trouble and inconvenience, nor their children to be baptized without great peril, both of soul and body, nor resort to hear divine service and receive the sacraments as becometh Christians, and by right they are bounden. And that's the same sort of language and excuses that all petitions to bishops carried. And they eventually won their day and had their own permission, own rights to bury the dead locally. And I think one of the latest is chapel style near Grasmere, which was about 1828. So that gives you an idea as to how long they were carrying it on for. Oral tradition suggests that the Corpse Road came into Kirby Lonsdale over Devil's Bridge. Let me just call this up for you. Which probably comes about from the name, but I find it somewhat unlikely because of the it just comes in at the wrong part of town. But of course, there were often more than one corpse road coming into the town. The problem with researching corpse roads and finding authentic information on them is that there's no medieval map with a sort of dotted line saying here be the corpse road. So it's very difficult to find good information as to the exact route. The petitions would often say which town they were going to and which parish they came from, but not much else. And they didn't always follow a logical route. I mean, you think you could just draw a line on the map and it would be obvious. But they don't always follow an obvious route. This is Grasmere Corpse Road. which some of you will no doubt have walked, which goes from Rydal, well, from Ambleside originally, to Grasmere. And instead of going along the bottom of the valley, it goes about a third of the way up the valley. And Grasmere historian Mary Armitt, who died in 1912, suggested that this was because the bottom of the valley was basically marsh until the road was built at the start of the 19th century. So the route had to go sort of a third of the way up the valley side, which makes for a slightly difficult walk. So when we were doing our research, we had to bear in mind, you know, when footpaths were built, when roads were built, and basically, you know, where it's likely that it would have gone. Maps, of course, offer a certain amount of information. Older maps occasionally would mention the church path or the corpse road. Corpse roads is just one word, one phrase for them, but church paths, beer roads, and other names were given to them. Ordnance Survey have one or two marked on them. The Shap, Mardale to Shap one is on there. But we also know that their information can be wrong. So Ordnance Survey maps used to show Corpse Road going basically from Keswick to Matterdale. But they corrected that on the next edition to be a coach road rather than a corpse road. And we know that the one on Sale Fell on the first edition was called a copse road and was then corrected to a corpse road. And we assume it's because it was originally a corpse road, but you know, there are those errors. Newspapers offer a certain source. Now, most newspapers didn't start really getting going until start of the 19th century, by which time most corpse roads had ceased to be. But they do often contain good clues and good information in the archives of the newspapers, usually around footpath disputes, because when there's a dispute over a footpath, invariably somebody comes up and says, but this used to be the old Corpse Road. And so we've got at least that oral tradition recorded in newspapers. And this is particularly true of the Corpse Roads that are at Urton, which is this side of Cumbria. Urton is just up from Gosforth. Let me just show you. Here we go. This is Urton Church. Beautiful church. I can highly recommend going there. It's got Burne-Jones stained glass windows, the ancient Urton cross, and all the rest. But this has got 3 corpse roads descending on it, and they were recorded properly in 1899 because of a very long-running legal dispute over one of these footpaths. And it started when Thomas Brocklebank, of the Lord of nearby Urton Hall, got fed up of people walking past his lounge window, or lounge windows would be more accurate. And he said, well, I'm just going to close the path off. So he closed the path off. And, you know, I think particularly us here in England and probably in Britain generally, you know, we don't use a footpath for about 30 years, but the moment somebody blocks it or closes it off, we all get up a petition and start shouting and screaming and romantically talking about how we used to walk it as a child. And that's exactly what happened in 1899. The people of Urton kicked up a real fight. And this was led by a villager called Joseph Burrows, backed by Bootle Council. It almost bankrupted Bootle Parish Council. And the dispute went to court in those days, and it went to Carlisle before a jury. And thankfully, the good work of the local newspapers, almost every word of it was recorded. And the good old Whitehaven News, which I worked on until recently, even produced this map showing the corpse roads and other paths in the area, which was a great resource for us to look at. in our book, by the way, we drawn this because it's quite blotchy, and so if you do need a more detailed one, um, either buy our book, yes please, or ask me and I'll email you a more detailed version. Well, the first thing that they did was the villagers said, look, this is a corpse road. And it's well known in law that if anybody walks a corpse road, anybody takes a body over a field or along a particular footpath, that forever becomes a public footpath forever and a day. And this was a very strong belief. In fact, it still is a strong belief. I've met at least one other person who still believes this to be true, and it gets tested in the courts about every 5 or 10 years. And the judge at Carlisle has said what other judges have said. No, there is no such law saying that if you take a body over a field, it becomes a public footpath. All you need to do is prove, as you do today, that it's been regularly walked. And so that's what the villagers set about doing. And it was quite good from our point of view, because they also dug out all the archive, all the court rolls going back many years, referring to the church path and its use and its tradition. So it was a great resource. And I'm just going to quote one that they used, which was the 1st of January, 1712. And this is from the court rolls. Also, we find that William Gateskill, William Tumban, Henry Hodgin, and Richard Walker complained against Susan Smith for not making their church road sufficient through her ground. We find Susan Smith to make their church way sufficient for bride and corpse, for horse and foot, betwixt and Michaelmas next, or be fined 13 shillings and 4pence. And what's basically going on there is what was very much the custom. I'm just going to interrupt here because the red wine the coffee has arrived. Say hello to Kirby Longsdale.
This is Lesley. Ladies and gents, you all right?
They're all on mute, but give her a wave. Thank you for the coffee. So it was always the custom, well, indeed the law, that you had to look after and keep clean the footpath in front of your house, and any footpath in front of your house to keep it tidy and usable. I think something that probably should be revived. Susan Smith didn't, and so she was taken to court, and that was quite a hefty fine. And one interesting thing, I don't know if any of you noticed in the reading out of that, is that they make it clear that it was also a bridal path. It was a path for the bride. Now we use bridal path as in the horse these days, and I'm sure in those days, but it was very clear from this that the bride also took this path as part of a tradition or special route to the church on her wedding day. And we also came across this at Irvington in the north of the county. So it's not all doom and gloom on Corpse Roads. It's there's some cheery aspects to it as well. So the trial went on for 2 weeks, and they presented all their evidence, and the jurors listened, and they came back, and good old juries, they came back and said, we can't decide. But we've got an idea. Why don't you all just sit around a table and work out a solution? And of course, that was never going to happen. So the case dragged on for another 5 years. It ended up at the High Court, and the final decision was made. And I'm glad to say, there it is, the villagers won. So the Corpse Roads survived. And indeed, the footpaths continue to this day to be there. Then some are in better conditions than others, but it's a lovely place to go. There's easy parking at the church. There are some parts of the Corpse Roads which are absolutely delightful. It's not too bad. There's 1 or 2 gates and muddy bits, but it's quite nice. You can in danger of losing the path on occasion with one of them. But the one I'd recommend is parking at Urton Church, and it's about half an hour walk along the Corpse Road, which was the main one of dispute at the trial, to Urton Hall, where you could throw rotten tomatoes at the Lord of the Manor, but it's actually now a hotel. So you can stop and have coffee and cake and relax, and then wander back to the church. Let me just stop that. So that was where we could look in detail at one particular Corpse Road and find good information about it. Often we come across just the oral tradition. Somebody will say to us, oh, such and such is the old Corpse Road. And there's no written evidence for it, but we include it on our map anyway, just in the hopes that we will eventually find some other corroborating evidence. But I think because of our background in journalism, we're always keen to record any oral tradition and any stories so that they're kept for future generations. One of the ones, I mean, we're looking at the moment is the Mardale to Shap Corpse Road, which has always been well defined, and I say is on the Ordnance Survey map. But talking to Jean Scott Smith, the local historian there, some of you will probably know, she's got a different route based on oral tradition. I think her family's been there for about 5 generations. And her mother explained that the Corpse Road didn't follow the straight line into Shap, which we put in our book and other people put in their books. It diverted away south of Shap, where it joined up with the Corpse Road coming in from Hardendale, and they then both joined together and swung back north to Shap Church, which sounds quite illogical. And you think, well, surely you just go the most convenient route, particularly if you're carrying a dead body. But this ties in with what Mary Armitt also said about Grasmere's Corpse Roads, and there are about 3 or 4 Corpse Roads around there, where she describes processions meeting up at various points. And so they wouldn't always follow the most direct route, but they would meet up with other Corpse Roads and continue their route. So I'm quite open-minded about Jean Scott Smith's version of the Mardale to Shap route, and as soon as lockdown's over, I hope to walk it with her. And anybody else wants to join us, really. Another oral tradition are ghosts. And I think we probably expected ghosts to be walking in abandon along Corpse Roads, but Workington Corpse Road has probably got more ghosts per square inch than anywhere else. But other than that, they're fairly hard to come by. But there is one famous ghost story associated, well, with 3 or 4 Corpse Roads. Shap to Mardale claimed this ghost story. Wasdale to Westdale claimed it. Garrigill claimed it. And I thought, I usually quote a bit from a website for those who don't know this story. But I thought I ought to quote from Kirby Lonsdale's own Marjorie Rowling, who wrote the definitive folklore of the Lake District, includes something on funeral traditions and mentions this ghost on the Corpse Road. So I will just conjure up a picture of the ghost, and it's only a paragraph long, but I will just read out her version of it. So that's the Shap one. Here we go. One of the wildest of these Corpse Roads was that from Wasdale Head to Estdale over Burnmore. This is said to be haunted by a galloping horse carrying a coffin. The story is that a young man, the only son of his mother, had died and was taken by pack horse for burial on a misty winter's day. The horse took fright and bolted, and the mourner's search, hampered by fog, was fruitless. On reaching home, the deceased mother collapsed and died. During her funeral, near the same spot where her son's horse had bolted, her pack horse also got away. Again, the search was hindered, this time by snow. But though the mother's horse and coffin were not found, those of the son were. He was duly buried. The mother's body, however, was never recovered, and the ghostly steed haunting the moor is thought to be hers, still carrying her coffin. And as I say, it's a fairly famous tale, and we rather remarkably, rather by good fortune, and thanks to the British Newspaper Archive, which is digitising all newspapers ever published, managed to find out where the true origin of this story was. And it was from a Victorian author. It's a true story, don't we? He was a fiction author generally. A gentleman called Mr. Hall Caine, Hallcaine. And I spell out his name because I can always usually confidently say he's the most famous person nobody has ever heard of. However, I said that at Keswick once, and Hall Caine used to live at Keswick, and a couple in the front row said, "Oh, we've heard of him. We live in his house." But most people have never heard of him. He was born 1853. He was the first author to achieve 1 million sales. One of his books was made into a silent film by Alfred Hitchcock. He was so famous in his lifetime that crowds would gather outside his house just in the hope of seeing him. He once went walkabout in New York, by the way, and the police had to be called to control the mob because he was recognized and was so famous that they almost mobbed him. On his death, the royal family sent letters of condolence to his family and led the mourning. 60,000 attended his funeral on the Isle of Man, and there was a special service in London afterwards. He was looked on as the next Charles Dickens, but within a few years of his death, he's been completely forgotten, probably because his books are not very good. But he's of interest to us because one of his books, called The Shadow of a Crime, which you can still get hold of, was basically where this story was first published. And when he was interviewed by the press about the book, they said, "Where did you get the idea for this story about this ghost haunting the moor?" And he explained that he first heard it from his grandfather when he stayed with him in Wasdale. Well, Hall Caine, born 1853, so we're going back to the late 18th century if the grandfather was indeed the first. And he said, "I was so gripped by the story and so excited by it, I knew that one day I'd have to write it down and tell it as a story," which he then did in the best-selling novel at its time, in the Shadow of a Crime. However, he made it quite clear in the interviews that the ghost haunted Styhead Pass. So all those Corpse Roads that had claimed this ghost, none of them were actually the real owner. And it was a Corpse Road apparently going over Styhead Pass, which was the real source of this. As I say, ghosts are part of the oral tradition, and you are literally chasing ghosts usually when trying to pin down these. More concrete are coffin rests, and coffin rests are usually just large stones. Let me just call up a coffin rest. Here we go. So this is the one just outside of the cottage at Grasmere. And again, like Corpse Roads themselves, there's no medieval map with a little cross on it saying, "Here's the coffin rest." We can't be sure in a sense that any of them are 100% genuine. But I've included this one because this is 99.9% genuine. And I say that as a journalist with complete confidence because there's an A4 notice next to it that says, "This is a coffin rest." So that's good enough for me. I don't know who put the notice up, but it was certainly recorded as well by Mary Armitt in 1911. I think we can be fairly certain that is indeed a coffin rest. And I'll just run through a couple more. I can get back to this. Done. Bear with me. I can't get rid of you. Stand by, stand by. Oh, there we go. It's all right. Well, this, as you'll recognise, is the strange-looking object on Devil's Bridge, which somebody told me was a coffin rest, but I'm not very convinced. But please defend it or otherwise to me. This one is very impressive. This is at Lampler on the Loweswater. Corpse Road goes on from Loweswater to St Bees, and it apparently comes through Lampler. And this is a coffin rest. It's apparently in somebody's back garden, but it's the main road goes along the outside, and it's got this big pillar in the middle of it, which I find interesting. And just finally, I will just talk a bit more about coffin rest and what they did. This is a coffin rest in a sense, because when we investigated the Bassenthwaite to Coldbeck Corpse Road, the farmer who's on the Corpse Road explained to us that this old barn used to be the inn where the procession would stop overnight to rest, and so he was very proud of his dilapidated barn, and it is on the public footpath, so you can go and visit this while you're walking that Corpse Road. Having said that, it was a couple of years ago I walked it, so it's probably bloody lets by now. But what is a coffin rest? Well, there's, I think, some modern confusion and misunderstanding on coffin rests. We often hear people sort of say, write about it being the place where, when people were carrying the coffin, they'd get to this point and they'd sort of basically say, gosh, this coffin's heavy. Can we just rest it down here on this stone for a while? And I don't think that was what they were about at all. For a start, as far as we can tell, bodies were rarely put in coffins until they got to the Lich Gate, despite the ghost, which we had the drawing of showing the coffin. It was more usual to wrap a body in a shroud or winding sheet, put it on a horse or a cart, and then take it over the fell, and then put it into the coffin when it got to the Lich Gate. And I think, as far as we've been able to tell, the coffin rest usually epitomized a place where the party would rest, as in pause, and they would sing a hymn or say a prayer, because this was a sacred route, and walking it was part of the funeral. So stopping it was like the Stations of the Cross, really. And so I think that's probably more accurate. And this is a quote from, in 1957, WI members from Westmoreland villages collected some of their local stories, and it included this about the Corpse Road going from Brackenslack Byfields to Meeburn and then to Crosby Church. And one of the WI members said it was the custom for a funeral coming this way to stop in Meeburn by the cross there, whilst the mourners, with heads uncovered, sang a hymn before finishing the journey to the church and cemetery. And we found other accounts of this in the 19th century of funeral processions stopping and singing a hymn or saying a prayer en route to the church. So, as I say, we've created a Google map with all these rumours and evidence of any corpse roads, and I'll share that with you. But we couldn't help, and I'm just going to finish off really with a quick tour. We couldn't help but get sidetracked by the wonderful stories of ghosts and the legends of funerals and traditions surrounding death and funerals in Cumbria. And again, I mean, Marjorie Rowling in Folklore of Lake District was one of our first stops, and she talks about a couple of these. One was the passing bell, which she said was rung at Kirby Lonsdale up until the 1930s. Hopefully somebody can tell me whether the bell still exists, although I don't know whether it's still rung. But the idea was that it was rung when somebody was dying. And I think the tradition basically faded out because people didn't always die when they were supposed to. And people survived and rallied round, and they'd already rung the passing bell. She also talked about a lovely tradition called telling the bees. This was an idea that when somebody died, it was important that you went to the local hives and you told the bees that Fred Smith had died or whatever. And here you see a woodcut of somebody draping black lace over the hives. And there seemed to be an idea that if you didn't tell the bees, they'd stop producing honey because they would be upset. Or also that if you told the bees, they would spread the message throughout the countryside. And we came across a lovely account of this, again, thanks to digitizing of old documents. And this was from a woman a young lady staying near Whitehaven in 1820. In fact, she was staying she gives a beautiful description of this thatched manor house cottage thing at Saneth near Whitehaven. It's actually where they're building the new Whitehaven mine. So it's a bit controversial at the moment, but it was a lovely house when she was there in 1820. And she explained that a lad in the village had died. And she wrote to her father, "We just left the house when someone whispered, 'The bees, the bees. Has anyone told them we're going?' I could not conceive what was meant. And Susanna, to whom the inquiry had been addressed, only said to me, 'Wait for me one moment.' And hastening back a few steps to the sunny wall where stood the widow's chief wealth, a range of beehives, she spoke to them in a tone of singular mournfulness, her words barely audible, they were so interrupted by frequent sobs, as she said, 'Toil on, pretty bees, toil on for the widow's sake. But he who loved you best, little Hugh himself, is this day to be carried out a corpse from his mother's house.' I learned afterwards that it was believed the bees would make no more honey if they were not informed when the deceased was going to be buried." So it's a lovely tradition, and I've not come across any beekeepers who still keep this up, but some do remember it being done in living memory. It would be nice to revive it, unlike the one up at Brampton, which I don't recommend we revive, but I'll just quickly tell you about it. And this is the Brampton Death Chair. And the Death Chair, we're grateful to Henry Penfold writing in 1906 about this. And he said, "Another strange belief which existed in Brampton until recently was in the efficacy of the death chair. It was described to me as a high-backed chair made of hard wood and well leathered or upholstered. Persons nearing their latter end were supposed to die more easily in a sitting position and in this chair than in any other way. The chair was loaned out by sympathizing neighbors, and it's not too much to say that hundreds of persons have died while sitting upon it. It's now some years since this gruesome relic was used, and the interval, the chair, along with other furniture in the cottage, has been seized for debt." So I have to confess, that's not a real picture of a death chair. I'd love to say you can go to Tully House or something and see it. But I sort of lovely, gruesome idea that, you're not feeling too well and the neighbors knock on your door and say, "Oh, I hear you're not well. We just brought the chair round." And, no, I'm feeling a lot better now. Thank you. Well, I'm going to finish off by just saying that these corpse roads are, at the end of the day, just nice walks, but they also help keep some of our history alive. They're sort of aids to memory, really, by having coffin rests and ghosts and the stories about funerals on them. But I think they can also serve another important purpose. The one at Grasmere is one of the most popular footpaths in the county. I think it was in ITV's top 10 of Britain's footpaths recently. It's always crowded with tourists. And I think the only reason it is because the parish council spent 10 quid on a bit of wood and a bit of white paint and blue paint and put this sign up saying "Coffin Route to Grasmere." And up until recently, there was nothing else to explain what the coffin route was. But I think because people had a choice of walks and just the name leapt out to them, and they said, well, we'll do the coffin route to Grasmere. And I myself have organised a few guided walks at Urton on the Corpse Road there, and even on a rainy Monday afternoon, we've had 20 or 30 people come along. They've all put money in the box at the church for the car park. They've walked to Urton Hall. They've spent money on coffee and cake or lunch, and it's been a good financial boost to Urton Hall. So I don't know if any businesses or Lonsdale needs more tourists, but if you do, I suggest we research a bit better the correct route of the, or the proper route of the Kirby Lonsdale footpath, and then we encourage the council to get a bit of wood and a bit of paint and put on their coffin route to Kirby Lonsdale, and that will hopefully encourage the tourists. On that, I will finish, and thank you all very much for listening patiently. And please fire away any questions or corrections or added information.